Good evening, everybody. Evening. I'm Dr. Patrick Lewis. I'm the president and CEO here at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Robert J. Turpin, an associate professor of history and the assistant director of the honors program at Lees-McRae College. He's the author of First Taste of Freedom, A Cultural History of Bicycle Marketing in the United States. Dr. Turpin received his PhD from the University of Kentucky, where we are in the grad program together, making this an especially important Filson occasion. He was awarded a fellowship from the Appalachian Colleges Association, which allowed him to spend the 2020 to 21 academic year working on this book. As we were just chatting, we've got to have him back for an oral history of the nightlife of Old Louisville, from his experience waiting tables over at the Old Amici's just across the parking lot from us. So look forward to that. We're going to book him again. Join me in welcoming Dr. Turpin.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. Scott Scarborough also for coordinating all this, as well as the Filson. And thank you for all you all for showing up. I've got people here that I've known since middle school that have come out to see me, and that means a lot. Almost a former father-in-law sitting in front here, Glenn Leach. Some people, various people that are connected, and it means a lot to see you out here. So thank you for that. Thank you for your time. I know that's an important commodity, a limited commodity that we all have. All right, so I'm Dr. Robert Turpin. I am originally from Lincoln County, Kentucky, about an hour south of Lexington, where I grew up. I lived in Louisville in the early 2000s. I attended Brandeis School of Law for a year and worked for the Legal Aid Society. During that time, I got heavily involved in competitive cycling. I raced for Clarksville-Schwinn, Jeffersonville-Schwinn first, and then once they closed, Clarksville-Schwinn, and rode with the LBC, the Louisville Bicycle Club. Did that for a while, raced around Indiana, Ohio, the Southeast, because I was doing mountain bikes. Decided that law school didn't seem to work, and so I decided I was going to go to graduate school. So I moved back to Lexington because that's where I got my undergraduate degree. And at first I was going to pursue studying the Holocaust and writing about that. Well, once I learned to get a PhD, you need to write a dissertation, and a dissertation makes an original argument about something. So you're going to say something no one said before. And I started thinking about how many books there are about the Holocaust, and I was like, oh. Sounded like it would take a long time to get there. And one of my professors suggested, well, you're really interested in bicycles. There's not a lot of work about bicycles. Why not write a social history of the bicycle? I was like, that's a great idea. And during that the second year there, I took an African-American history class. And my professor, Dr. Gerald Smith, suggested that once he found out I was into cycling, he suggested I read this book by Andrew Ritchie, which is about Major Marshall Taylor, or Marshall Major Taylor. And I had never heard of Major Taylor. I was kind of surprised about that, because not only did I race bicycles all around, but I consumed cycling news in any way I could, magazines. I was buying DVD copies of the Tour de France footage from the 1980s with John Tesh doing the music in the background. I was really nerdy about my interest in cycling. And in all that time, I'd never heard of Major Taylor. Major Taylor was an African-American champion cyclist in the United States. He was a world champion. He won the world championship in 1899. So he became a world champion cyclist in 1899. And what struck me is that in all my time riding a bicycle, racing bicycles, watching bicycle races, watching the Tour de France, I never saw anybody of color. It was a very white sport. And so then I started thinking, well, if there was this amazing athlete, this man who wins a world championship that's world renowned, in the 1890s, how did we get to the point where we are today, where the sport is seemingly so white, from my experience? So it's that question that led me on the search. And one of the first things I wondered was, well, if there was Major Taylor, was he the only one? Surely he wasn't. There must have been other Black cyclists. And in Andrew Ritchie's book about Major Taylor, he did mention another Black cyclist named Woody Hedspeth. It's another picture of Taylor here, a little bit older. I mean, Taylor was a phenom, even by the age of 14. I mean, people were starting to know who he was. He grew up in Indianapolis. I can talk about how he got into cycling. It's a little bit of an interesting story. His father worked for a wealthy family who had a son that was Major Taylor's age. And his father would bring him to their house to play with their son. And their son really liked Major Taylor so much that he petitioned his parents to get Major Taylor a bicycle so that they could ride bicycles together. And so that's how Major Taylor got into riding bikes and became pretty adept at it, well enough that he was able to get a job working for a bicycle shop in town. A lot of times they would kind of have him do tricks outside on the bike as a sort of publicity. And that's where he got the nickname Major, because they would dress him up in a general's jacket, sort of like a soldier's jacket, to put on his show. Okay, so, but Ritchie also mentioned, I should back up. All right, so I said I hadn't heard of Major Taylor. A lot of people hadn't heard of Major Taylor, but he's gotten more and more coverage. Andrew Ritchie's book came out in the late 80s, I believe. Since then, there's, Major Taylor wrote an autobiography. That's why we know a lot about him. So he published an autobiography in 1928, I think. There have been 9 biographies at least written about him, 3 children's books, an Australian film about him that was put out in the 80s. There's been a recent documentary about him that was published by PBS. And there's also a major film. I think Mandalay Pictures is working on a film about Major Taylor, with John Legend giving a lot of the money to support that effort to put out this. So he's getting a lot more press. Some people may have known him from a Hennessy commercial, which is problematic. For one, Major Taylor was a teetotaler. He would not drink ever. And he was very open about that. He would not race on Sunday. And thinking about the fact that, now Hennessy's trying to use Major Taylor to sell their liquor, what he would think about that. I sent him an angry tweet at one point. I don't know how how those things go. So the fact that Hedspeth was mentioned, you made me realize it wasn't just Taylor. There was Hedspeth. So what's Hedspeth's story? There's Woody Hedspeth propping up Major Taylor before he starts this race. And then are there other people? And so, as you may have guessed, I did eventually find out that there were a lot of Black cyclists in the 1880s, 1890s in the United States. And so the story, really what I wanted to do was resurrect some of the stories of these athletes from this period. Cycling was huge in the 1880s and 1890s. It's in the United States today, it's not quite as popular. It's not nearly as popular, actually. In Louisville, cycling's pretty big. Where I live now in Tennessee, I mean, there's 30 or 40 people who ride bikes. And in Louisville, I'd go out for a group ride on one night and there would be 50 to 60. So, it's pretty big here. In the United States, you don't see coverage of even the Tour de France is hard to find in the US. You've got to have certain packages of internet access to be able to see stuff like that. So in the 1880s and 1890s, though, it was just growing exponentially. It peaks around 1898, 1899, with production of bicycles peaking at 1 million in those years. And then it kind of just drops off a cliff. My first book, The First Taste of Freedom, was focused a little bit more on bicycle marketing and what were all the forces that led bicycling to have this sort of climax and then a rapid fall. So it makes sense that people all over the US were interested in cycling. If we look back at the early history, and I don't want to get into too much, because really what I want to talk to y'all tonight is about Louisville and Louisville's part in this story that is in my book. So, early bicycles, some would argue that this early one in 1819, this hobby horse, some would argue that it's not even a bike, because it's a walking machine. But then by the 1860s, we get the bone shaker, which no suspension, no rubber tires. Mostly you're riding these indoors, what would be like roller skating rinks, but a lot of times it's on like the second story of a building. The columns in the room are all padded because people are just crashing everywhere. And there's a story of some man who crashed through a window and fell onto the second story of the building next door and rode away. I don't know. Then we get into the period where high wheelers become popular. So in the 1870s, these high wheelers are popularized. They can go faster because they have a larger wheel. You notice that there's no chains yet, right? So these are kind of direct drive. The bigger the wheel, the faster you can go. Also, a bigger wheel helps absorb some of the cushion, helps you roll over small objects. But the problem with these high wheelers, these were also called ordinaries. All your weight's on that front wheel. If you hit a rock or a pothole, it's really easy to, what they said, would call take a header to fly off the bike, and you're pretty high up. So that was problematic. Another problem with the high wheelers was that this is a day and age when women were supposed to wear dresses. So if they're up at that a little bit higher wearing a dress, you might be able to see some ankle, and that would be sacrilege. And also, just the mere fact of a woman straddling a bicycle was too much for some people to handle. They had side saddle bicycles they invented for the real women out there and the ladies. Women were also expected maybe to ride tricycles. Tricycles were actually more expensive. They were heavier, took more material. But these, for a while, tricycles were seen as really the more genteel version of a bicycle. And it was those rowdy young punks that would ride these ordinaries around on the sidewalks and just all kinds of being uncouth. But pretty early on, there were high wheel races, there were tricycle races. And so I found even before Major Taylor, there were black cyclists. There were black cyclists of some notoriety before Major Taylor. So one of the men I talk about in my book was this man named John Williams, who was a champion tricycle racer. He had several records. One of the records he had was for riding up Quarry Hill here. This is in Boston. It was known as a pretty steep pitch, and that's where people would go test their ability to see who could ride up a hill the fastest. He had the record on a tricycle, and one of the stories said that maybe he was the only person to actually get a tricycle all the way up the hill, because other people would have to stop and walk it up. There are also men like Charles Van Dever who built his own bicycle. He built his own ordinary using an auger, some parts from a wagon, a draw knife. He describes all these things he did. So this is a black man who was, and this was published in several newspapers and journals that talking about his ingenuity and his ability to create his own bicycle. So bicycles were really very expensive. They're still expensive if you get the high-end stuff today. I mean, you can pay more than $10,000 for a racing bike. Back then, we see prices of well over $100. It could be a full year's salary if you paid for the top-end bicycles. So some people learned to make their own bicycles. he claimed to have ridden this one over 1,000 miles, which seems crazy. You can notice the back wheel, he just drilled a bunch of holes to remove weight from that wheel, so it wasn't just a solid wooden wheel. But then there were also, this is an unidentified black man riding a high wheeler. So there were some of these people who were, John Williams was a little well known. Charles Van Dever just kind of makes his way into news articles because he built his own bicycle. But then there were other racers like David Drummond, who races, he made the transition from an ordinary to what would become called the safety bicycle. The safety bicycle is like the triangular frame bicycle, called the safety specifically because it's not as dangerous as those high wheelers. You're not as prone to fly over the front wheel because now you're sitting sort of in the center, equally sized wheels. Now there's a chain, so you can, the wheels don't have to be huge. You can change the gearing to make the bike go faster or slower. So David Drummond, though, he raced throughout Boston, and one of the challenges we have as historians is that we are always writing about something outside ourselves, something outside our own community. So obviously I didn't live during this period. I'm not Black. I don't know that experience. And we don't have, for these men, I don't have anything that they wrote themselves and left behind. So to try to say what they were feeling or what their intentions were, really I just have to read into the acts, the actions that they took. David Drummond, though, so in kind of what I was trying to figure out with these men were whether they thought of themselves as activists. And it became clear to me that whether they thought of themselves as activists or not, they were activists because they were doing something that was considered an activity for upper class people and something that could be kind of like a way to show off that you had money, because bikes cost money. Having the free time to ride a bike meant that you had some form of economic security. You might have had a job. There was times where you didn't have to be at work. So it was a way to show status, to ride a bicycle around town. David Drummond, though, it was easy to tell he was more than that. He was involved in some fraternal orders like the Knights of Pythias. He ran in circles with James Monroe Trotter, William's father, who was the first Black postmaster general. He was a part of this organization of Black gentlemen in the Boston area who would take note and keep track of times in which they felt that their equal rights were violated. And so they were keeping this record of times where they felt like they were insulted or that someone sided against them. So he's a little more of an open activist than someone like Major Taylor, because Major Taylor relied more on his records and his ability on the bike to speak for himself. What these men were doing, in a lot of athletes of this generation, we talk about this idea of muscular assimilation or disproving the idea of racial inferiority through showing that they are just as talented, if not more talented, than white men they're racing against. So that's when it becomes a problem, though. So for Major Taylor and people before him, they were able to compete in integrated bicycle races. They could race against white people. But by 1894, there was a decision to be a little more strict in segregating bicycle races. So this is 2 years before Plessy v. Ferguson. And I think if there weren't Black men who had been successful on the bikes, if Major Taylor was getting beaten by everybody, they wouldn't have cared. The problem was he was beating these white men. And Black cyclists, these men are making as much money as their white competitors if they win the race. So it's one of the few areas where they could get equal pay for equal work, and also show that there's no physical inferiority here. So Taylor, relied mostly on his abilities. He didn't say a whole lot in the press, more like a Tiger Woods or a Michael Jordan, just I'll let my acts speak for me. I don't need to come out and have this big agenda. But Drummond, a little bit, behind the scenes, we could see that he's actually thinking of himself more as an activist. All right, so I mentioned 1894, and this is where Louisville comes into the story. Oh, there were also Black women who rode bicycles, and I have a chapter focusing on this. And a lot of times they aren't racing bicycles, but this is unidentified. We're not sure who that was, but it's a photograph of a Black woman on a bicycle. It shows that they were riding bicycles. Kitty Knox was a little bit more of a well-known figure. She's from the Boston area as well. She was interesting because she would win like costume contests. She was a seamstress, and she would make her own bicycle kits. And all the descriptions of her talk about her being this. One of the descriptions was a comely colored maiden. They loved alliteration. A black buxom beauty. Like all these descriptions of her as being attractive, and how white men were flocking around her and talking to her. And then she starts to catch a lot of flack from white women cyclists who were jealous. What is interesting to me about her is that she was described as beautiful, but also strong. And this is in a period when strong isn't necessarily seen, or it's often not seen as a feminine attribute that leads to beauty, right? But she was both. Another unidentified, well, her name's Anna Morrison, but I don't know anything about her. This is San Francisco, and this is from the photograph collection of Lawrence Shields, who you would know. But so with Louisville, though, this is where 1894 becomes a thing, or becomes important. So this man, Colonel William Wagner Watts, he is the most important singular figure in this development that happens. So Wagner was his mother's maiden name. His father was William O. Watts. He served as a regimental quartermaster in the 37th Infantry in the Union Army. William O. goes on to become an attorney, practicing in Louisville. Young William would follow in his footsteps. William Wagner Watts graduated from Male High School. Is that where you worked? No, okay. So he graduated from Male High School, and then from the law department of the University of Louisville. I guess that's before they called it the Brandeis School of Law. That would make sense. So one obituary describes Watts as an ardent sportsman who was a member of the South Park Fishing Club and a former president of the Audubon Country Club. For our purposes today, it was his involvement in cycling that's more pertinent. So he was a member of the Louisville cycling scene. This was just before the Louisville Bicycle Club was born. He served as president of Kentucky's chapter of the League of American Wheelmen. That was the large sanctioning body for bicycles and bicycle racing and everything during this period. So he was the president of the Kentucky chapter. He was also the editor of a journal called the Southern Wheelman. So it's about the cycling developments in the South, right? In 1892, Watts begins a movement to convince the League of American Wheelmen to draw the color line. The Kentucky chapter does it first. They decide they are going to bar Black people from being members of their club. In 1893, the League of American Wheelmen has a meet in Philadelphia, and William Watts goes there to ask the League to insert the word white into their constitution. It would change the constitution from saying any amateur wheelman can be a member to say any amateur white wheelman can be a member. He loses, the vote loses, or he's not successful there, but he remains resolute. The next year, 1894, the meet is held in Louisville. So now he's on his home turf, and he's still making this argument that we need to bar Black people from being members of the League of American Wheelmen. Some of the members of the League were like, but we only have 8 to 10 Black people that are a member of the club anyway. His counter argument was, if we don't have those people, then we're gonna have thousands of more white people that will join the club in the South. It's the fact that we have a few Black members that are keeping all these white people from being a member. You know, they're not gonna be a member of this club if we have Black people in the club. So in 1894, they come down to Louisville to meet, and their meeting is to be held at the Galt House. This is the second iteration of the Galt House. I think we're in our third iteration. The first burned down. The second was raised in the 20s, and then the third was built in the 70s, the one downtown now. So just after lunch on Tuesday, February 20th, 1894, Colonel William Wagner Watts of Kentucky took the floor in Parlor B of the Galt House Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky, his hometown. Standing there before the 178 delegates in attendance at the National Assembly of the League of American Wheelmen, Watts endeavored to put the finishing touch on a goal that seemed his sole objective for more than a year. He was there to ask the League of American Wheelmen to add one simple word to their constitution. That one word was white, and it was to be added to a critical passage. If adopted, the law constitution would read, any amateur white wheelman is eligible for membership. Most of the delegates sat quietly. Some may have dragged lightly on cigars, paying more attention to their tobacco than Watts. After all, this was not the first time they had sat through such an appeal from the dark-haired and thickly mustached 34-year-old Kentucky lawyer and editor of the Southern Wheelman. Just 1 year prior, during the 30-minute soliloquy at the National Assembly of the League in Philadelphia, Watts cried out, "I demand in the name of the South that the word white be inserted into the Constitution." On this day in Louisville, he doesn't grandstand like that. He spends most of his time on the floor reading a letter from a Black cyclist from Louisville named Frederick J. Scott. Frederick J. Scott was the president of the Union Cycle Clubs. There was a Black cycling club in Louisville in the 1890s. He's the president of that. That letter essentially said, if the League of American Wheelmen don't want us Black men to be, or Black people in general, to be a part of their club, then we don't want to be a part of their club. Why would we want to be in a club that doesn't want us? That was Watts's argument that, look, Black people don't want to be a member of it either. And we're just going to, this is just to help membership grow. So he reads that letter, and then he says, I must excuse myself. My daughter's at home sick. I ask that we take this vote with no discussion. And he leaves. But before he leaves, he says, oh, and also that whiskey that was promised to you will be handed out by Colonel Johnson, who was a secondary member of, he was a secretary of the Kentucky League of American Women. He leaves, and they table the discussion about the amendment, and they first vote on where the next meet will be held. That was a contentious debate because the meets brought a lot of people, hundreds of people. And it's almost like hosting the Olympics or something. You want your city to be the host because you're going to get all this revenue from the people there. So he tables that, they have that vote, and then they come back to the amendment. I think something that Watts learned in 1893 is that maybe he didn't have all the votes he thought he did. And he learns maybe more about caucusing and working behind the scenes to get those votes before it even comes up. So the night before this vote is to be held, he asked the chief of police of Louisville to sort of give the wheelmen a carte blanche to do whatever they want. And the policeman's like, yeah, all right, y'all can go out and do what you want. We won't really harass you. So the papers allude to some of these things that, like, you have to read 5 or 6 different sources to figure out what's going on. But I'm going to come back to those. All right, so, there might just be a cartoon and with no explanation. That their dog never lets nothing go till it's dead. This year coon cost $3. And then this is a souvenir which each delegate carried away from Louisville, a Bella of Nelson whiskey bottle. Through reading a couple different sources, we see that, William Watts asked the police chief to let them do whatever they want. They go out for a night on the town. They watch a dog and coon fight. So they basically watch a dog kill a coon. And they're using coon, and I think that's important to think about whether it was a metaphor, because cycling journals from this period used all the racial epithets you can imagine. They watched a cockfight. They all came back to the hotel stinking drunk, hungover the next morning. There's jokes in the newspapers, in the articles about how they needed bracers or hair of the dog. And there's, I think, there's a cartoon of Kentucky hospitality in the bellman serving up their bracers in the morning so they can get up and go have the meeting. So the night before they're to have this vote, they go out on the town, get really drunk, have a really good time. The meeting the next morning, Tuesday morning, was supposed to start at 9 a.m. People start dragging in by like 15 after 10 or so. At first, there are only 5 or 6 people there. So they're kind of dragging in. All had apparently a good night. And this was a way to try to bond with those men and to try to convince them, to support Watts's amendment. And then also that whiskey that was planned. So that whiskey, G.E. Johnson was another important Louisvillian that I mentioned, who was a high roller in the League of American Wheelmen. He was described as the ablest newspaperman in the South, and he was the private secretary of Colonel Henry Watterson. He served as a circulation manager for the Courier-Journal and the Louisville Times. And he was also highly involved with the Kentucky chapter of the League of American Wheelmen, serving as the secretary-treasurer in 1891. He lived just down the road at 1919 Floyd Street, so not too far from here at all. He retired from circulation managing in 1917, but continued on as private secretary for Watterson. Ultimately, he died unexpectedly at home on June 21st, 1921, at the age of 62. He had began his career at the Courier-Journal as what they called a printer's devil. That was back when the type was handset, so I guess he was doing that. Then he moved on to become a reporter and a telegraph editor. The paper said he knew Watterson better than anybody, more intimately than anyone. He'd also served as the private secretary of General W.B. Haldeman for a number of years. These are big time people in Louisville. And I think it's interesting of Watterson and Haldeman, because Watterson famously has a brush up with Ida B. Wells, saying that she's being a little too hard on the South when she's investigating the lynchings that are happening in the South. And then Haldeman goes on to become the commander-in-chief of the united Confederate veterans by the 20s. He was, I don't think he really had any elected positions, but he was really strong leader in the Democratic Party in Kentucky and the horse racing scene too. So these are all really influential people at this time, and it's a lot of power in the League of American Wheelmen. So that vote in 1894 was successful. It carried by 7 votes. They needed, since it was a constitutional amendment, it needed 2/3 vote. They got that by 7 votes. That makes the league now only for white amateur wheelmen, but it's not retroactive. So the 6 or 7 people that were already members of the League of American Wheelmen that were black get to stay members. Kitty Knox joined just before that vote. So Kitty Knox stays a member of the League of American Wheelmen and continues to go to the national meets to show up to be like, I'm still here. What are you gonna do? Which is awesome. They put in a clause. They're like, anyone can remain a member who's black as long as they pay their dues in a timely fashion. You know, any kind of way that they could be like, oh, well, you're a day late. Sorry, you're not a member anymore. But my book is, this is just like 2 chapters that I focus on what happens in Louisville. The bigger book, the book's more about black cyclists before and after Taylor. So even though they vote that black people can't be a member of the League of American Wheelmen, there are still black cyclists. There are still competitive black cyclists. There are still black cyclists who are quite successful. I said Major Taylor doesn't win the championship till 1899. Well, how's that happen? They decided that the racing body that comes on after the League of American Wheelmen decides that the only black person who would be allowed to race as professional would be Major Taylor. All other black men would have to race as amateurs. If you race as an amateur, you can't win cash for money. You can't win cash for the race. You can maybe win a prize. Basically meaning you're going to have a job. You can't pursue that as a career. So that really limits you. In cycling, you're training 6 hours a day, 6 to 7 days a week sometimes. It's hard to have a full-time job and race at the elite levels. So Taylor, though, not only was he allowed to race in the United States as a professional, but he and Woody Hedsmith, who I mentioned before, start to race abroad. They race in Paris, Russia, Australia. That's why there's an Australian film about Major Taylor, because he went there, he loved it. He named his daughter Sydney after Sydney, Australia. The black cyclists felt like they were greeted with open arms in Europe and Australia in comparison to what they were experiencing in the United States. They did experience racism in Europe, and oftentimes it was because of Americans who had come over that were saying, why is he in this hotel? Black people shouldn't be in this hotel, and demanding that they be removed. But the prize purses were bigger there. So Major Taylor, Hedsmith, Melvin Dove, there's quite a few black cyclists who decide one way around not being able to race professional in the United States is I'll go to Europe and I'll race. Hedsmith ends up living in Europe, spending almost the rest of his life there. Well, yeah, the rest of his life. He's living in Paris, France. He married a ballerina. He continues to race and train and teach people how to race bicycles late into his life. He ends up being evacuated from Vichy, France. So once the Nazis take over France, that's when he's finally like, okay, now maybe it's not as good or great. So he's convinced to be evacuated. He makes his way to Portugal, to Lisbon, where he ends up dying of a combination of cholera and another debilitating disease, and they burn all of those effects. His body wasn't to be disinterred for 5 years. He's still buried in Lisbon. One of the things I found about these cyclists is that all of them end up dying in poverty and almost remote obscurity. Taylor, the thing that was good about him is that he wrote an autobiography. And his purpose in that, he said, I want kids who are like me to know about me and to see that there's this example out there and that they can be like me. Other examples, 3 of the men I talk about become institutionalized, be it in the prison system or in mental health systems. David Drummond, who was an activist, secretary, clearly intelligent, could read and write. I could see his transition from in the directories and in census. He started out as a spar maker, which is like a woodworker for ships in Boston, and works his way up to working at a bicycle shop. So he sees some social mobility, but he ends up spending from about age 30 to the end of his life in the Worcester State Mental Institution. It's different, states are different about medical releases, what they'll let you see. So I wasn't able to see why David Drummond was put in prison. But I know 2 of the other cyclists, one ended up being put in a mental institution because of syphilis. Starts to lead to him having hallucinations and things like that. Another cyclist was put in prison for, the first time he was arrested for lewd and lascivious cohabitation. So he's arrested for living with a woman to whom he was not married. So all these stories, I talk about in the introduction that this isn't really a feel-good story. We're used to these sports stories about, oh, yeah, they came from nothing and then they made it. Major Taylor was one of the wealthiest. He was probably the wealthiest man in Worcester, Massachusetts. After he retired, he was the first person to have a car there. He owned a house. He owned a couple other properties. He rented those properties to people. But over time, there was a couple business ventures that he kind of loses on. He tried to go into the automotive industry. He tried to patent a type of tire and all these things. So he slowly loses his money so that by the end of his life, he's living at the YMCA in Chicago, going door to door, trying to sell the autobiography he'd written. It's a sad end for all of these cyclists. Kitty Knox dies around age 25 of weird liver infection. So I'll read you a part from talking about the end of Taylor's life. I said 28, but it's 32. So by 1932, Taylor was still in Chicago, still staying at the YMCA, but his health was fading fast, suffering from prolonged hypertension and myocarditis. In March, biography Andrew Ritchie believes Taylor suffered a stroke or a heart attack. He was admitted to the Provident Hospital, which specialized in cardiology. And like the Wabash YMCA, it also catered to the Black community of Chicago's South Side. There, Taylor underwent heart surgery. Still, his condition did not improve. A month later, he was moved to the Cook County Hospital, where he would live out his last days. In his autobiography, Taylor tried to express the great weight, both physical and mental, of being a Black man in the United States. In addressing all the questions he had encountered or why he quit racing when he did, he explained that people just don't realize the great physical strain and the utter exhaustion I felt on the many occasions after I'd battled under the monster of prejudice, both on and off the track. In death, he could finally shed that burden for the first time. It's quite possible that he was alone when the time came. No contact was made with his wife or daughter, and so the only potential visitors would have been his brother and sister, the friends he made since beginning the sojourn at the YMCA, and James Bernard Bowler. Bowler was a Chicago City Commissioner, a former professional cyclist who would go on to become a United States Congressman. Taylor surely knew him from his racing days, since their careers overlapped, and rekindled the relationship while targeting former cyclists when selling his book. Bowler was an influential friend who had helped Taylor gain admission to the Providence Hospital, which was a private institution. Reading the speeches made at Jim Bowler's memorial, his similarities to Taylor stand out. Bowler, described as a champion of champions, whose name was a household word throughout the nation, was also a man of his word who never deviated from the simple virtues. He was considered deeply religious and never too busy for those in humbler stations of life, as well as a devoted husband. He was celebrated for all those attributes, and they were described as what made him a great American and a successful politician. Marshal Major Taylor, infamous for his teetotaling and obstinate refusal to race on Sunday, even when faced with fines, was all of those things as well. Yet the paths of Bowler and Taylor diverged so drastically after their racing careers came to an end. Taylor was much better known as a cyclist than Bowler, but unlike Bowler, he was unable to ride the wave of his notoriety after hanging up his bicycle. Bowler had at least one glaring advantage over Taylor. He was white. Though they both suffered heart attacks, Jim Bowler died at the age of 82 while serving as a United States representative. Major Taylor died at the age of 53, homeless, destitute, and alone. Even then, 53 was relatively old for a black man, for whom the average life expectancy was around 47. When Bowler passed, 25 U.S. representatives and 2 senators rose to eulogize the man. 1 week after Taylor's death, no one had even come to claim the body. And so he was buried at public's expense in a pauper's grave in a plain wooden box in the welfare section of the Mount Glenwood Cemetery, a Jim Crow burial site about 30 miles south of downtown Chicago. Jim Bowler deserved no less than what he received. Taylor, on the other hand, deserved much more. Thank you. So there will be time for questions, and after the questions, if you have more things you want to talk to me or tell me stories or anything like that, I will be over there where the books are for sale, signing those and talking to you about whatever.
So if anybody has questions, I'll bring a mic.
Yeah,
Hi.
sorry.
Thank you. Daryl Mathis, I'm with Major Taylor Louisville. Question for you, can you kind of expand a little bit about how Major Taylor was received internationally by other countries compared to how he was treated here in the U.S.?
In Europe, in France, he was taken around everywhere, taken to the opera, shown off, and he got to experience all of fine society and high society while in Europe. So the treatment there, you know, he was treated more like an equal, but then there's also a question of was he also treated like this exotic thing that they're trying to show off? Like, look at this. When Hedspeth came over, they called him Black Number 2. So the newspapers wrote about him as being Black Number 2. Oh, now there's a second black person here racing bikes. And so there is, you know, Taylor saw it as being much better than what he experienced in the US. And one of the things I didn't talk about in the US is even as when he's racing, Major Taylor found that white cyclists would team up against him. They would form packs and they would be like, all right, we'll work together and we'll split the money. All we're doing is making sure he doesn't win. We'll make sure Major Taylor doesn't win, and we'll split the prize money amongst ourselves. So they would like pocket him because this is track racing, right? They could pin him against the rail so that he can't get out and sprint to the finish, or they might try to wreck him on purpose, things like that. So he felt like he was often in danger, and he would experience that in Europe too, but it was the white cyclists, again, that from the America that had come over. But it is complicated because for Taylor, he writes about how warm and welcoming they are in Europe, and they are, but then the motivations are what's going on there. Is he truly seen as an equal there, or is he just being seen as something special and something to show off? Race promoters wanted him in races because they knew that having a black man race against white men was much more likely to generate ticket sales. So a lot of the times, you know, he got to race not because a promoter felt it was the right thing to do, but because they knew they could make more money if he was in the race.
How was it that Major Taylor was the only black man allowed to race professionally in the US?
The sanctioning body that came about after the League of American Women, I think was called the NCA, the National Cycling Association, they were the ones who granted you a license or conferred professional or amateur on you. So they would be the ones that dictate whether you could race as a professional or an amateur. There were some local venues that would every once in a while allow a black cyclist to race as a professional, and then there would be a huge outcry from white cyclists, basically saying, we won't race at your venue, or we're not going to do this. And so it's through the organization, but then also all the white cyclists insisting that we're not going to break this rule, and if you do, then we just won't race.
So why then was he given an exception?
What's that?
So why then was Major Taylor given an exception?
I think part of it was that he was pretty well known even before the color line was drawn. So even by when they decide to insert the word white, they get the only reactions we see in print from black cyclists are Frederick Scott that I mentioned, and they seek out Major Taylor. I think he was 16 or so at the time. And he was sort of the same of like, well, if they don't want us to be members, then why we don't want to be members? And we could form our own club, that sort of thing. I think it's that the fact that he was already successful and he generated ticket sales. The promotions for these races would often say white versus black. You know, these are mock race battles in some ways. And he also was devout Christian, teetotaler, respectful, you know, all these things that like didn't seem like he's going to cause a lot of trouble. I think all those things led into it, but the fact that he'd already proven himself, it'd be kind of hard to shut him out at that point.
Major Taylor did sign up one time to come to Louisville to race at the Fountain Ferry bicycle track. He usually avoided racing in the South because he knew he wouldn't be welcome. When he got here, got to the track, all the other white racers refused to race with him. They said, well, you weren't supposed to be here. There's a race in New Albany the next day on Sunday. Of course, he wouldn't race on Sunday,
Yeah.
but nobody would race against him over there either.
Yeah. Yes, he lost a lot of money because he wouldn't race on Sundays, just like Ali lost his title, right? It's, you know, because he stuck to his principles, even at the financial burden of it.
This seems to be on the heels of black jockeys being
Yes.
excluded. So
Yes.
was this a result of the actions that were taken against black jockeys, or are they not really, it's just coincidence that it all happening at the same time?
It's bigger, right? It's several things where we're starting to see. All right, so this is a big thing that I talk to my students about all the time. Like, we like to think about history as being this linear progression, like things are always improving, right? But then we think about the Civil War ends, slaves are freed, and for a moment during Reconstruction, it seems like this moment of promise. I'm getting in Patrick's bag now, and then it gets worse. Lynchings go up, radical racism, the Klan is born. all these reactions and starting to segregate in sport and private bodies. I said 1894 here, the Plessy v. Ferguson to bring Jim Crow, to codify Jim Crow is 2 years later. But, you know, in several sports, we start to see racial lines drawn pretty early. Baseball also. Boxing is one where it's takes a little longer, but yeah, there's a lot of similarities with black jockeys, and a lot of black jockeys die in poverty. If you've read Racehorse Men, I mean, it's a similar story, and also some of them are going abroad to try to get around this. Other things that black cyclists are doing, they start doing roller races. So you're not racing on a track, you're racing on these two drums. If you've ridden bikes and you know about these things, and oftentimes there's something to track your progress. They started performing in vaudeville on their bicycles, doing tricks. So they're finding alternative ways to still use the bicycle to make money if they can't race as a professional. Yeah. Other questions?
You mentioned the Australian film. You know, are you talking about the miniseries Tracks of Glory? The Australian TV made for TV series. It was like
This is from the 80s.
3 episodes, I think. I was able to watch a few of those on YouTube.
Yeah, yeah.
And
I haven't seen them.
yeah, they're not easy to get. You can't purchase them. I think you could maybe purchase them in Australia. I don't know how. It's been hard to. They've been hard to find. But I was just wondering. Just wanted to make sure there wasn't a movie I didn't know about that was Australian. Maybe that's what you were talking
I
about.
think that would be it from that
Right.
period. Yeah.
And I had one more thing I wanted to ask about. I'm real fascinated with you know, Major Taylor's family is from Louisville, and I assume there are some descendants that are still here. Or and I know that he was like to kind of elaborate on what Carson asked or said that he was invited here to the annual meet, and he had supposedly had reservations at the Brown Hotel, and they turned him away. And when he showed up at the track, they wouldn't let him race.
Yeah.
And I think I read that in another Major Taylor book, but or maybe I read it on the internet. But you know,
Yeah.
that he never returned back to Louisville after
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, and for Taylor, you know, there are these other biographies that get into a lot more detail than I do about Taylor, because what I want to tell the story of all these other black cyclists. Hedspeth's also from Kentucky, originally born maybe in Lebanon, Kentucky. Parents moved to Greene County, Kentucky, and then eventually he ends up in Indianapolis, like Major Taylor. We have two with these Kentucky roots. A lot of their families come from North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, probably former slaves, because they're right during that period that they're making the move to the north. But it's Taylor, you know, moves to Worcester, Massachusetts, so that he'll have more ability to race up there. I think he had a big scare at a race in Savannah, Georgia, when he's trying to race down there. He went out for a training ride, and his life was threatened, and that kind of made him think, I shouldn't be in the South really racing. It's too much of a risk.
You mentioned earlier that, you know, history is not really linear, and it makes me question, you know, in 1899, he was a world champion. And then you think about 2024 is the first African to win
Stage.
a stage in the Tour de France and to win the green jersey. Why do you think this, I mean, so much time has gone by before we finally have history made for Black cyclists?
And this is a more difficult question that I try to get at in my epilogue, talking about the present day Because like I said, you know, in my time watching the Tour de France and all that, I never saw black cyclists, but more recently there's been a couple Eritrean cyclists, so Northern Africa. I there's been this long history of black people being excluded from cycling, and then it becomes a sport it's not really a way to make money in the United States. But we have some black cyclists today, like Justin Williams, Rassam Bahati, who are trying to change this. And Justin Williams is really intentional about showing up to races in his Ferrari with his Nikes on and his chains, listening to rap music. And he's like, I want kids to think this is cool because they don't think it's cool and they don't want to race bikes. And I want them to think that it's, you know, something that you can make money from and be good at. So I think this history of exclusion has bitten cycling in the butt, so to speak. And it's also, you know, kids grow up not seeing black people ride bikes. So they don't think of themselves as, you know, they don't think of that's something I could do. You know, some of the people I interviewed from the 60s that get into racing, they're from New York, and there was a little bit of a scene of black cyclists there, and they see some cyclists and they're like, oh. So it's kind of that, you know, representation mattering, that if they don't see it, then they can't envision it as much.
Well, it's a fantastic place to bring it all back around. Thank you so much. Another round of applause.